Cristina, and today I'm going to talk to you about how my research resulted in tangible changes in one of the most threatened areas of the world, the Atlantic forests of Brazil, and also how it can be used to change other parts of the world too. So this is a picture of me, the age of 9, in my parents' farm in Brazil. I was born and raised here, and this bit of forest that you see in the back of this image is a very degraded version of the beautiful Atlantic forest, which is a tropical forest that runs along the coast of Brazil. As I was growing up, I saw firsthand how environmental degradation could impact the lives of people and the species around us. And I made a decision to commit my life to help changing that. And back then, never in my wildest dream, I would have imagined that in 2017, there would be 2 pieces of legislation being passed into Brazilian law that was a result from research that I had done to enable the reforestation of the Atlantic forest. So what happened between my 9-year-old self and 2017 is the story that I'm going to talk right now. So this photo was taken in the Amazon by a colleague of mine. And this is an image of forests worldwide that we're getting all too used to seeing in the news now. So we know that the way that we're modifying the world is leading species to extinction, and we know that we have to do something to stop this extinction. The problem is that every time the importance of saving species is raised, someone somewhere will raise issues of costs to the economy. And it's understandable. How can we send millions of people into poverty by denying them their own rights to use the land as they wish? But we know now that the trade-off between conservation and economy doesn't need to exist. We can aim for a win-win situation where farmers produce the same or higher levels of food and the environment is maintained. But to reach this ideal situation, we need to change our mindset. And changing our mindset isn't easy. Some say that we're now living in the Anthropocene, which is the era of human domination over the world. We had enough of being chased by predators. We eradicated crippling diseases such as polio and smallpox, and we are at a stage now where obesity is becoming a bigger issue than famine. The world is ours, and many of us think that we can continue to change the world or change the environment as we wish. But the reason why it's crucial that we change our mindset, it's because whether we want it or not, we rely on natural system around us. And we currently take for granted all of the services that nature provides for us. For example, 1/3 of all crops are pollinated by animals. And because it's so difficult to cost these services, we often think that they're free, but they're really not. So in Brazil alone, pollinators contribute with $12 billion per year to the economy. And because we change the environment so much, insect populations are going down, and pollinators in particular are going extinct around the world. So we are going to have to pick up that bill on pollination. And when I mean we, I mean our generation and our children's generation. And the way we're changing the world doesn't only lead to a decrease in species that we like, it also leads to an increase in species that we don't like, such as Lyme disease, for instance. And it also puts us at much greater risk of contact with new diseases such as COVID-19. And of all the ways that we're modifying our planet, deforestation and habitat fragmentation are the main drivers of biodiversity loss. It's been estimated that 1 million species are going extinct just because of habitat loss. And in fact, many say that we're now experiencing the 6th mass extinction, which is a similar event to when the dinosaurs went extinct, except now we have more species going extinct at a faster rate. So for our own sake, we need to change our mindset that we can modify the world as we like, and we need to stop this loss of species. So what are the ways that we can protect biodiversity? The most usual way people think about this is through protected areas, which have a crucial role in maintaining biodiversity across the world. And as here is a good example of a protected area in the Amazon. However, in populous places like the Atlantic forest or Europe, for instance, most areas have already been heavily modified and they are quite economically active. So we need to find alternatives to preserve biodiversity. And One such alternative is to preserve biodiversity within farmland. So the main advantages with this approach is that farmers will benefit from the spillover of services that species provide. So such as pest predation, and a cooler microclimate and protection of bodies of water. We don't want these services to be tucked away inside protected areas. We want people to benefit from them. Really important. But obviously there are disadvantages as well. And the main one is that it's costly. And in the Atlantic forest, farmers get an average profit of $500 per year per hectare. And this is more than the Brazilian minimum wage. So it's understandable that many of them would be reluctant in engage with conservation. But there are a few ways when we can direct payments to farmers to set aside land for conservation or manage their land in a more sustainable way. So there are conservation schemes such as payment for ecosystem services, which direct payments with this specific purpose of increasing water quality or carbon stocks, for instance. And there are government schemes such as the Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy, which encourage best practices in farming. So there are ways around it. But even if we have the money, so how much habitat do we need to set aside for conservation? And can we get away with strips of forest like this? Or do we need a much larger piece of forest like this one, for instance? And this question is really crucial, because if we set aside too much habitat, then it becomes too expensive. And if we set too little, then we're not going to be saving species. This question has been asked by many different groups, and until we published our work, there wasn't much of a consensus around. And this is usually because of one or two problems. So A, because people often focus on one species or a group of species, or because they only focus on a total number of species. And two, or B, because they often measure the size and isolation of habitat fragments as if they were islands. And I could talk for over an hour with all the problems with this approach. So we created a novel approach. We measured the integrity of the environment. And this is basically the green similarity in the species present in farmland when compared to protected areas. So for instance, if we, let's pretend that this is a protected area and with these species, and if this is the case, then this fragment here would have a higher integrity than this other fragment here. And this is because despite the fact that they both have the same numbers of species, the larger fragment of forest has species that are more similar to the ones that we find in protected areas. And we measure the proportion of habitat cover in the region around the site where we collected our data. And we chose to address these questions in the Atlantic forest, which is a biome with a very large number of endemic species. So these are the species that only occur in this region and nowhere else in the world. So for instance, we have over 8,000 endemic species. We have over 100 endemic birds. So these species cannot be found anywhere else. And the Atlantic forest was once the second largest tropical forest within South America. But now there's about 130 million people living within this region, and collectively they're responsible for 70% of Brazil's GDP. So this area now has been reduced to less than 12% of its original extent. And although this deforestation has been ongoing since the European settlers arrived in Brazil, we're now reaching a stage where there is a real risk of committing that thousands of species would be going extinct unless we do something about this. So we collected data on mammals, birds, and amphibians for 6 years, and we calculated how the integrity of the vertebrate community changes with forest cover, and we showed that the minimum amount of forest required to preserve biodiversity in the Atlantic forest is 30%. And we showed that biodiversity is not dramatically altered until 30% of forest cover, but the species found below this threshold are completely different to those found above the threshold. And in the study, we also showed that the services they provide are two completely different. Right, so we need 30% of cover, but the Atlantic forest is a lot less than that. So what do? Well, first we protect everything we have standing. This is non-negotiable. But we also need to increase the amount of forest if we want to prevent future species extinction. We can't reforest everything. That would be unrealistic and that would be unfeasible. So we created a prioritization framework that maximizes value for money. And we then calculated how much it would cost to reforest these priority areas in the Atlantic forest. And our results show that with $200 million per year, which sounds like a lot, but it's equivalent to 6.5% of what Brazil spends on agricultural subsidies, it would be possible to direct payments to farmers who are willing to increase the amount of set aside within their land. And we can focus restoration on areas with low agricultural yield as well. So if we create set-asides in priority areas, that would incur in a loss of only 0.61% of the agricultural GDP produced in these municipalities. And payments would be directed at the very same people who would spare their land for conservation. And on the top of that, we also get an increase in biodiversity and ecosystem function levels that are equivalent to those seen in protected areas. I'm going to be honest with you. When I set out to do the study, I wasn't expecting to find such a clear and simple message that we need 30% of forest cover and it would actually be feasible and cheap to reach this. So the fact that we found such a clear message meant that our results were then used to inform 2 new environmental resolutions in Brazil. So one was just for the state of São Paulo, where the aim was to improve water security for the 43 million people who live in this state. The other one was at the federal level, and our 30% threshold was used alongside socioeconomic layers to select areas where reforestation should be prioritized and also restore these areas back to 30%. So with the help of government and NGOs and industry and universities, this policy will have an impact on restoration, increasing the amount of forest cover by 700,000 hectares by the end of this year, 2020. But to put this into context, the UK has pledged in its 25-year plan for the environment to increase 180,000 hectares of woodlands by 2042. So the impact that this has had is quite dramatic. But now let's look at the rest of the world. I mean, there isn't anything specific about the Atlantic forest or Brazil that makes it unique. We can find this threshold, this minimum amount of habitat required to preserve biodiversity for every habitat in the world. And this is important. We can't supply our results to other parts of the globe. We certainly wouldn't need 30% in all places. And in fact, in another study also published in Science, and if you want to hear more about it, you can look up an article about fractured forests in the New York Times. We show that biodiversity in tropical forests are a lot more sensitive to deforestation than those in the temperate zones. And it's most likely that in Europe, it would need less habitat to preserve biodiversity than in the Amazon, for instance. In the Amazon would need a lot more. And a while back in the day, we had to spend months and years in the field collecting data. Now we can use advances in acoustic modeling, acoustic monitoring and machine learning and remote sensing to obtain information on thousands of species across hundreds of sites at a fraction of the time and cost that we used to do. So with this new technology, we can collect data that we always dreamed of, such as telling whether species are stressed or not. So we're using right now machine learning on acoustic data collected over 300 sites in Costa Rica. And we can not only tell where spider monkeys are found, but we can also develop a model where we could detect the different calls. And we can detect also whether they are more stressed in certain environments. And this would allow us to detect tipping points before there is even a population collapse. And this is very important. This is a highly threatened species. So my vision for the next 10 years is that we can find this threshold for all biomes in the world. This is feasible. It's hard work, but can be done. We have theoretical expectations of how this threshold should vary from place to place, and we can use data to test these models. And the reason why this is so important is because currently many countries around the world, such as England, for instance, are using the approach of restoring nature to a bigger and more connected state. But what does that even mean? I mean, this is a great approach, but we don't know exactly what that means. Do we need 1 square kilometer, or do we need 100 square kilometers? And how do we define connected? What's connected and what's not? It would be a lot easier if we could say we need 10% forest cover, we need 20% of forest cover, or habitat cover, sorry. And then we can discuss which areas within a country are in most desperate need for restoration. There's certainly no money or personnel to act on all places at the same time, but we need to prioritize areas. And once that is done, we can use a bottom-up approach where we define priority area within priority areas, which soils or terrains have lower productivity, and reverting them to a native habitat state would incur in a minimal loss to the economy. And we can also define how this new habitat will be created, whether those 10% need to be all in one clump of habitat or scattered in different fragments, or whether we need to create a corridor to allow species to move through the landscape. Another advantage of this approach is that as more data come in, or as priorities change, we can adjust this threshold up or down. We don't have to stay with this number forever. So if we are successful in creating networks of native habitat through farmland, then something amazing is going to happen in 20 years, because we're going to dramatically reduce the impact of climate change on species and on us as well. First, because we'll be sequestering a very large amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So in the Atlantic forest, the estimate is that by restoring priority areas, we're going to be sequestering about 1 billion tons of CO2. And this will help mitigate global warming, but it will directly benefit species as well. And this is because the climate has always changed in the past, and species have always adapted to a changing climate. But in past events, they also had continuous habitat to move through. The main problem now is that there's so much fragmentation of habitats, and species cannot move through the landscape anymore. So if we can restore the landscape, and if we can restore a large amount of habitat within farmland and across many areas of the world, then we can increase habitat connectivity, and we can create the right amount of habitat for these species as they reach a better climate. And we don't only help species. I mean, we can improve ecosystem services for farmers and urban people alike as we increase water security or filter air pollution. We can create green spaces where people can reconnect to nature, and this will have a dramatic effect on mental health. And we can provide an economic safety net for farmers who are dealing with the uncertainties of a new climate. But there are only advantages to this approach. As the UK leaves the EU, it'll end the basic payment schemes, which was under the Pillar 1 of the Common Agricultural Policy. And this was about £2.6 billion that used to be paid to farmers according to the size of the land they own. And will in future be paid in a way that incentivizes farmers to restore and improve the environment within their land. So we have the means and opportunity to implement a similar system into practice now. We just need to change our mindset. And I hope I have convinced you that we can preserve species while feeding an ever larger human population. So the approach I presented today is a pragmatic one. We can't save all species, and we can't rewire the whole planet, but we can dramatically reduce our impact on biodiversity, and we can preserve the environment for our children. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take questions now.
Cristina, thank you so much. I especially enjoyed the discussion on restoring habitat within farmland and that kind of balance. So I have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience ahead of the event, but I know that we also have a question that has come in today. So the first one is, do you think that all the benefits of nature have been fully discovered yet? And if not, then what might be new ways that we can see nature start supporting us?
That is a really good question. No, I think we're just scratching the surface of all the services that nature could provide for us. And this is because we often forget that we are part of nature. We evolved for millions of years with a natural environment. And we don't even know what could be done. So for instance, it's very difficult to know what is it that we don't know, but I suspect that the next revolution will be regarding the microbiome. So for instance, there are studies showing that people who live in farms have more bacteria, a higher diversity of bacteria in their skin, and they are less likely to develop asthma or allergies. And there are a very large number of studies at the moment talking about gut microbiome and how they can impact mental health and autoimmune diseases. And all of this will be coming from the environment around us. So I think what we will find next is that we've modified our world in a way that it's probably leading us to have a poorer health.
Mm. And then from one of the questions that came in from Gerard Greg Smiths, he asked, can you give examples of wild non-microbe species we don't like, which are environmentally important?
Non-microbes, yes. And it's a funny one because, for instance, we have evolved with parasites. And, through millions of years, we've had parasites, and now we have a much more hygienic environment. We can avoid having parasites, except that some parasites actually help us avoid developing autoimmune diseases. So it's the sort of thing that maybe a hookworm here or there wouldn't be that bad. So it's complicated, but we don't know yet all of the species.
There's another question that's come in from, I'm sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Joao Rodriguez, who asked, how do you approach governments to take a look at research and act upon it? Is it through lobbying via international organizations like WWF, or what is the way?
So the way that this happened was through a think tank in Brazil. It wasn't me, myself individually knocking on the Ministry of Environment's door. So yes, it does need a lot of interaction. And I confess that this all happened also in the last government that Brazil had. That was a very close interaction between academics and the Ministry of Environment. So you need to have the governments somehow willing to listen, but many of them are willing. It's just that you need someone to make that hook.
And I think we'll have time for one more question and then we'll move on. So do you imagine urbanism playing a bigger role in conservation in the future? If so, then in what way?
This is a very difficult question. I would say yes and no. No, because I don't think that native habitat within urban environment is the place to preserve species. And there's too much pressure from humans, and if we want to preserve species, we need some place for them to be a bit more protected. On the other hand, I think that there's a lot that creating more habitat within urban environments can help us. So for instance, it could reduce flooding, it could reduce a number of other problems that we have, and it could allow people to, again, reconnect to nature. And it's so important to have this ability to walk in a green area, and this will have a huge effect on mental health.